When I came back from Portland that Sunday night, the living room felt wrong. It wasn't just the rearranged furniture or the faint scent of citrus cleaning spray. Something was missing. It took me a few seconds to realize the space by the bay window was empty. My mother's piano, the antique Steinway that had lived in this house since before I was born, was gone. My chest tightened. I stood frozen in the entryway, staring at the void where it had always been. I walked over slowly, trying to process it. There was no note, no sign it had been moved temporarily, just a subtle square of cleaner carpet where it had sat, like a ghost had evaporated. I called out, "Dad?" But only the hum of the refrigerator answered. He emerged from the hallway a moment later, rubbing his eyes. "Oh, hey Nat, you're back early." "Where's the piano?" I asked, skipping the greetings. My voice sounded brittle. He blinked. "What piano?" I stared at him. "Mom's piano. The Steinway." His face shifted, the way it always did when he was trying to avoid conflict. "Oh, that. Eileen took care of it while you were away, said it was just gathering dust, said it was time to declutter." I felt heat rise in my chest. Declutter, that was Mom's. She played that thing every day for 20 years. He gave a helpless shrug. "You haven't touched it in years. You don't even live here anymore." "She's been dead for 2, Dad," I snapped. "That was the last thing she ever touched in this house. And you let her just get rid of it?" Before he could answer, Eileen walked in from the kitchen with a glass of wine, her expression flat and unbothered. "Oh, I didn't realize you were back today," she said, not missing a beat. "About the piano." "It was old, sweetie. We needed the space. Honestly, it was kind of an eyesore with that cracked bench and the chipped keys." I looked at her like she'd just spit on my mother's grave. "You sold it." She tilted her head. "Well, it wasn't exactly doing anyone any good just sitting there." "Where is it?" I demanded. "I don't remember the name, some collector from the city. He came and picked it up on Thursday." I turned back to my dad. "You let her sell it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "She said you wouldn't mind." I couldn't breathe. I stormed past them into the garage, my hands shaking. I rifled through the small stack of paperwork on the desk by the door. Receipts, mail, junk. And there it was. A printed copy of a Facebook Marketplace sale. Antique Steinway upright piano, fair condition, $600, 0 cents. Must pick up. The seller's name? Eileen Fisher. My heart sank. $600, 0 cents. That piano was worth at least 40 times that. But the money didn't matter as much as what it symbolized. That instrument was my mother's soul made tangible. It was where she escaped, where she cried quietly when she thought I couldn't hear, where she taught me to play Brahms when I was 9. And now it was gone, sold like an old chair because my stepmother wanted to open up the space. I stood there, gripping the receipt, while the fluorescent light flickered overhead. My fingers curled around the paper until it crumpled. Something in me broke, but not in the way they expected. They thought I would cry, maybe yell, maybe plead, but instead I went cold. This wasn't just about a piano, it was about everything. The erasure, the dismissal, the way Eileen had slowly scrubbed my mother out of this house. Her photos boxed, her books donated, her garden replaced with gravel. Fine, they wanted clean, I'd give them clean. I would scrub her dreams right out from under her. The night after I found the receipt, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom, staring at the yellowed ceiling and listening to the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my father's footsteps. This room hadn't changed much. Same faded wallpaper, same bookshelf half filled with old paperbacks and forgotten trophies. Even the floral comforter my mom had picked out for me in high school still lay on the bed. It was like a time capsule of who I used to be. And yet downstairs, the rest of the house was being gutted, piece by piece, not just physically, but spiritually. My mother's presence had been erased, not abruptly, but methodically, like layers of paint slowly stripped from wood until only the raw grain of Eileen's preferences remained. I had been trying to be respectful. I didn't live here anymore. After Mom died, I moved into a small apartment closer to the university where I worked. I told myself that letting my father move on was part of healing, that not interfering in how he managed his grief was a form of support. But in retrospect, all I'd done was give Eileen space to replace everything that once made this house feel like home. My mother had been gone just under a year when he married her. It was fast, too fast, but I hadn't fought it. She was a colleague of his from the school district. Efficient, pleasant on the surface, well-groomed in that way where every hair is in place but nothing feels warm. The kind of woman who wore beige sweaters and pearl earrings to Sunday brunch and always spoke with a fixed smile. Eileen didn't fight. She didn't yell. She just moved things. It started small. A lamp here, a chair there. The bright red rug my mother adored was replaced by a neutral one to brighten up the room. The floral curtains were too old-fashioned and disappeared one weekend. She boxed up my mother's cookbook collection and dropped them at Goodwill without telling anyone. My mother's bedroom became the guest room. Eileen wasn't violent, she was calculated. She didn't burn anything down. She quietly packed it away and claimed it had always been that way. The piano had been the last thing, the immovable thing. Too heavy to pretend she just stored it. Too specific to pass off as clutter. It anchored the house, just like Mom used to. That's why she waited until I was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind spun in spirals, memories, anger, plans. I pulled out my laptop at 3 a.m. and started digging. I didn't even know what I was looking for at first, but my brain refused to sit still. I searched Facebook groups, estate sale pages, local antique listings. I scoured eBay for upright Steinway plus Seattle plus 1800S. I knew the serial number by heart. Mom used to have it written on a little index card she kept in the piano bench, in case it ever needed repairs or appraisals. It took me 2 hours to find the ad. Someone had cross-posted a listing on a vintage instrument forum, gushing about the incredible deal they'd just scored from a seller in Redmond. I clicked the link and saw the photo. There it was, my mother's piano, restored, polished, placed in a high-ceilinged room that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. The seller was tagged. His name was Martin Blake, a collector of historical instruments and a minor YouTube figure in the classical music world. I watched one of his videos just to be sure. The piano was in the background, already in his home. I emailed him. Politely, I explained the situation, told him I wasn't demanding anything, only asking if he might consider selling it back. I even offered more than what he'd paid. Hours later, he replied. He was sympathetic, said he understood the emotional connection, but no. He had already lined up a buyer, someone who had offered him 5 times what he paid, and he had to consider it an investment. "I'm sorry," he wrote, "but I'm not in a position to hold on to it for sentimental reasons. I hope you understand." I closed the laptop and just sat there, staring at the darkness outside my window. I felt sick. It wasn't just about the piano anymore. It was the realization that even when I tried to reclaim something, it was already out of reach. It had been taken from me before I even had the chance to fight for it. And the worst part, the woman who took it would never be held accountable. Eileen would never feel bad. She didn't understand loss the way I did. To her, it was just an object, a transaction, an opportunity to open up the floor plan. At breakfast the next morning, she was already dressed in a linen blouse and slacks, sipping coffee while scrolling her phone. My dad was in the garden, tending to his tomato plants, oblivious as always. She looked up at me with that same plastic smile. "You look tired," she said. I didn't answer. I just sat across from her and studied her face. The smug serenity, the confidence of someone who believed the battle had already been won. And maybe she was right. Maybe she had won. But something about that idea made something shift in me, a low, slow burn. I couldn't bring back the piano. I couldn't make her apologize. But maybe, just maybe, I could make her pay. That thought alone gave me strength I didn't know I had. I spent the rest of the day wandering through the neighborhood, noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The historic plaques on old buildings, the preserved facades from the 1800s, the signs warning about zoning changes and heritage protections. My mind latched onto an idea, a wild one, but the kind that made my pulse race. Eileen had married into this house, but she had plans. I'd overheard her talking on the phone about renovating the second floor, converting the garage, maybe even selling and downsizing in a few years. I remembered her bragging about how much the house had appreciated and how she knew exactly how to prep it for a 7-figure sale. What if I could make that impossible? I opened my laptop again that night and began researching the local historical preservation board. I looked into property ordinances, zoning disputes, landmark petitions. I didn't know what I was doing exactly, but I was good at reading between the lines. My work as a historian involved digging into details connecting obscure pieces of the past to the present. I could do the same here. I started building a case, not in court, but in paperwork, in precedent, in community support. She wanted to erase the past. I was going to bury her future in it. 2 weeks after I began researching the preservation board, my plan started to take form, not as a single bold move, but as a series of quiet, strategic actions, each one nudging Eileen's perfect little world closer to collapse. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not even my best friend Margot, who usually knew everything before I did. This wasn't a story I needed advice on, it was a mission. A slow, cold balancing of the scales. Eileen had stolen something sacred, and I had no intention of reacting with petty revenge. No shouting match, no family drama. I would hurt her where it counted, her finances, her control, and her future. I started with the house itself. My parents had bought it in the late 1980s, but the original structure dated back to 1911. I confirmed this through the county assessor's website and then requested the public property records. The architectural style was craftsman, rare for our area, and beautifully preserved in some parts of the home that Eileen hadn't yet updated. I knew this house had potential as a historic resource, and I knew Eileen had no clue. She didn't care about history, only value. Next, I filed a preliminary cultural resource evaluation request with the local historical commission. It was a simple form online, but it kicked off a process that would trigger a temporary freeze on major alterations to the property. In the description section, I wrote, "House has significant architectural integrity and historical relevance to early 20th century settlement patterns in the neighborhood. Original structure includes period woodwork, windows, and layout." I attached photos I had taken as a teenager for a school project, images of my mother standing proudly beside the piano, the original moldings intact, the window frames with hand-carved detailing. I included those intentionally, knowing full well what they would suggest. If this house was evaluated and flagged, it could be eligible for historic protection. And if that happened, it would enter a legal gray zone where any attempt to sell or renovate would require multiple rounds of review, community approval, and in some cases, state-level sign-off. A week later, I received a polite but enthusiastic email from a representative named Darren at the commission. He thanked me for my submission and asked if I'd be willing to provide additional background. I replied that I was a historian, that I'd grown up in the house, and that I had more documentation about its original layout and significance. We scheduled a phone call. Darren was warm, passionate about his work, and clearly the type of person who'd pursued preservation not as a job, but as a calling. He told me that they had very few houses from that era left untouched in the area. "If everything you've told me holds up, this could be a strong candidate for landmark consideration," he said. "You'd be surprised how fast neighborhoods get scrubbed clean of their roots these days." I told him I wasn't surprised at all. By the time I ended the call, I was vibrating with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a solid start. The application triggered a notice that would be sent to the property owner, my father, informing him that the commission would be conducting a preliminary inspection in the coming weeks. Any planned renovations or sales would be advised to halt until the evaluation was complete. And the best part? I knew Eileen was already deep into planning what she called the reconfiguration. She wanted to knock down a load-bearing wall between the dining room and the kitchen, open up the space for modern resale value, and flip the upstairs into an Airbnb-friendly suite. She'd even started ordering samples for flooring and custom cabinetry. I knew because I overheard her on the phone with a contractor bragging about her timeline and return on investment. I didn't say a word. Instead, I spent a quiet Sunday afternoon digging through my mother's old boxes in the attic. I found floor plans, hand-drawn sketches, and her annotated blueprints from a home tour she once organized with the Neighborhood Historical Society. My mom had been a romantic about houses. She believed in soul and memory and narrative. Every item in her home had a story, a reason. She was the one who refused to install recessed lighting because the shadows tell better stories with sconces. Now, I was weaponizing that love of hers, not out of spite, but out of fierce protection. Eileen wanted clean lines and open concepts. I wanted permanence, resistance. The letter from the city arrived 2 days later. It was addressed to my father, and I watched as he opened it at the kitchen table. Eileen was standing behind him, drinking her green smoothie in workout clothes, flipping through a Pottery Barn catalog. "What's that?" she asked absently. He frowned. "Something about a historical commission. Says someone filed a preservation request on the house." Eileen laughed. "Preservation? Are they serious? This place is barely standing. Who the hell would even bother?" I sat at the counter, quietly eating my toast. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Her eyes landed on me for a second, narrowed just slightly, and then looked away. But the seed had been planted. Over the next week, I made myself as invisible as possible. I walked the dog, I worked remotely. I smiled politely at Eileen when she complained about bureaucrats sticking their noses where they don't belong. She called the city twice, trying to get the process reversed or dismissed. They told her politely that the evaluation would continue as planned. She asked who submitted it. They declined to say. I knew from my research that the commission didn't disclose complainants unless subpoenaed. For Eileen, who thrived on control, this was intolerable. She started snapping at my father, blaming him for not keeping better track of what's going on under this roof. He just shrugged and retreated into the backyard more often. 3 days before the inspection, I overheard her on the phone with her sister, whispering viciously about some neighbor ratting her out. She had a list of suspects. Mrs. Hayworth from 2 doors down, who always gave her dirty looks. The old man across the street with the historical markers on his porch. She never once considered me. That Friday, a black city SUV pulled into the driveway. Darren stepped out along with a photographer and another staff member. I greeted them at the porch like any other neighbor would, pleasant, informative, helpful. Eileen wasn't home. She'd gone out to a design showcase across town. My dad looked bewildered, but didn't interfere. I walked them through the house, highlighting the original features, the unrenovated fixtures, the untouched trim. They took photos, asked questions, nodded thoughtfully. When we reached the space where the piano used to be, Darren stopped. "What was here?" he asked, gesturing to the obvious rectangle of unfaded flooring. "My mother's piano," I said evenly. "It was the centerpiece of the room. She was a local musician and teacher. That's her in the photo there." He looked at the framed picture on the bookshelf. My mother sitting at the piano, smiling, bathed in light. He nodded. "Thank you. That helps." When they left, I felt a strange mixture of grief and triumph. Grief because it reminded me that this battle was only necessary because my mother was gone, but triumph because I knew something had shifted. This house was no longer just a commodity in Eileen's portfolio. It was a question mark, a roadblock, and I had put it there. Not through rage or revenge, but with quiet, deliberate precision. Let her figure out how to navigate that. Let her try to sell a house with a pending landmark status, with restrictions, with a flagged file in the city system. I had started something that couldn't be undone overnight, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had control. Not over the past, not over the loss, but over the story. And I wasn't done writing it yet. Eileen returned that evening in a mood I could only describe as brittle. She didn't explode, didn't raise her voice, that wasn't her style. Instead, she walked in with her keys clutched tight, dropped her designer purse on the kitchen counter, and asked in a voice clipped like paper, "Did something happen here today?" I looked up from my laptop. "What do you mean?" She crossed her arms, her eyes cold and calculating. A city vehicle was in the driveway. 3 people walking around taking photos of the house. Care to explain? My father, who had been dozing in his recliner, stirred slightly but said nothing. I set my laptop aside and gave her a casual shrug. "Oh, them? That must have been the historical commission. They're conducting a preliminary site review." I let the words hang in the air. She blinked. "And why would they be doing that?" I smiled, slow and steady. "I suppose someone thought the house had historical value. Original architecture, period fixtures, a bit of local cultural heritage. You know how it is." The color drained slightly from her face, though she masked it well. "This house is not historical, it's just old. A teardown, if anything. Who would even do that?" "They didn't say," I answered, standing to pour myself a glass of water. "But they seemed pretty enthusiastic. Said they rarely find homes this well preserved in our neighborhood." She stared at me like she was trying to read through my skin, peel back my skull, and get to the truth she couldn't quite name. I held her gaze for 3 full seconds, then turned back to my glass. She left the room without another word. By Monday, the formal notice was posted in the front yard, a discreet wooden stake with a laminated sign announcing the proposed landmark status evaluation. It was a standard legal form with public comment periods and notice of upcoming hearings. But to someone like Eileen, who had already begun courting buyers with glossy pamphlets and quiet showings, it might as well have been a billboard that read, "Unstable asset, proceed with caution." I watched her reaction from my bedroom window. She stood at the edge of the yard in her robe, staring down at the sign like it was some sort of personal insult. She stood there for a full minute, arms folded, then turned and marched back inside. The next hour was a storm of phone calls. I could hear her pacing, her voice rising and falling as she talked to the city, to her realtor friends, to some poor soul named Diane who got a full breakdown of how this was an outrageous abuse of power and clearly a vendetta. I didn't disagree. That afternoon she called a family meeting. It was a rare thing, and the tone in her voice made it sound like we were about to discuss a terminal illness. I sat at the dining table across from her, my father between us, blinking slowly as if hoping to avoid taking sides. "I want to know who did it," Eileen said. "Whoever submitted that petition to the city. Someone's trying to sabotage us." I asked, my tone cool. "Isn't that a bit dramatic?" She glared. "You're the only one in this house who would care about preserving anything. Your mother's ghost doesn't count." My father flinched. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "Well, if someone did submit the request, they clearly had their reasons." "You're ruining our plans," she snapped. "We've been working on listing this house for months. I've already spoken to buyers. There's an offer coming next week. If this goes through, the value tanks. Nobody wants to deal with historic designations. They tie your hands." I leaned forward. "You mean you can't gut it and flip it for a profit?" Her nostrils flared. "You're being childish. And you," I said quietly, "sold my mother's piano for $600 because you wanted more space." She opened her mouth, but I cut her off. "You've erased her from every room in this house. The piano, the books, her furniture, even her garden. You didn't marry my dad, you annexed his life." My father made a low noise of discomfort. Eileen turned to him. "Are you going to let her speak to me like this?" He looked down at his hands. "Maybe you shouldn't have sold the piano, Eileen. You know how much it meant to Natalie." That was the first time he had defended me since my mother's funeral. Her mouth opened slightly in shock, then closed. She stood, trembling with quiet rage, and left the room. I stayed at the table for a long time, the silence humming in my ears. My father didn't say anything else, but he didn't leave either. In the following days, Eileen ramped up her campaign. She began calling city officials, trying to argue against the house's eligibility. She organized a small meeting with a lawyer to see if she could sue whoever had filed the application. She wrote an email to the commission demanding to know who had falsely misrepresented the property as historic. The commission, to their credit, responded with patience and process. They explained that her objections would be heard during the public comment phase and that no final decisions would be made without due diligence. But the freeze on renovations was already in effect. Her construction plans halted, her open houses paused. Her timeline, her control, her dominance, gone. I watched it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction, not gleeful, not triumphant, just steady, like watching the tide erode a sandcastle. Eileen had built her future on this house, on flipping it, selling it, and moving into a newer, shinier one she could call her own. She had even joked once at dinner about getting rid of the baggage once my dad retired and they started over somewhere warmer. I was the baggage. The past was the baggage. Well, now the past had become a foundation, and it wasn't going anywhere. Then came the letter that changed everything. A registered mail envelope arrived addressed to Eileen. She opened it in the kitchen, eyes scanning the contents. She read it once, twice, then slammed it on the counter. "You have got to be kidding me." I walked in acting casual. "Everything okay?" She pushed the letter toward me. "They're officially beginning landmark proceedings, a full review, public hearings. They're inviting community members to submit memories, stories, photographs, anything to support the designation. Do you know what this means? I can't sell this house. I can't renovate. It's frozen for months, maybe years." I skimmed the letter. "Wow, that's a process. You think this is just some harmless paperwork? You've destroyed our equity." I looked her in the eye. "You destroyed something too." I just made sure you wouldn't profit off it." She stared at me for a long time, breathing hard. "I'll find out who did this," she said. "And when I do..." "You'll what?" I interrupted. "Sue them? Intimidate them? Smear them online?" I took a step closer. "You don't know how to fight this because it's not a fight. It's paperwork, it's process, it's city hall and regulation and cultural memory. It's everything you can't scream at until it obeys." She didn't reply. She just stood there, watching me, eyes burning. For the first time, I saw her afraid, not of me, but of something worse: powerlessness. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the house couldn't be listed, couldn't be remodeled, couldn't even be repainted without potential violation. The commission's next site visit would include a full photographic documentation and historical consultation. I'd already submitted my written statement, complete with photos, dates, anecdotes, and an affidavit from one of my mother's old students, who remembered taking lessons on the piano that had once sat in the living room. And that was just the beginning. Eileen wanted a clean slate. I had given her concrete. Thick, unmovable, historical concrete. And no matter how hard she pressed or plotted, she was stuck. Just like that laminated sign out front. Just like the memory of my mother that refused to be erased. The offer fell through 3 days after the historic review was publicly posted. It happened quietly, the way big financial shifts often do, an email from the potential buyer's real estate agent, followed by a short, clipped voicemail to Eileen from a man who had once fawned over the timeless charm of the property. After reviewing the pending historical status and legal implications, he said, "My clients have decided to withdraw their offer. No apology, no room for negotiation, just a clean break." I watched Eileen replay the voicemail 3 times at the kitchen table, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping against the ceramic mug in front of her. Her face was an unsettling blend of disbelief and calculation, like someone trying to solve a puzzle, only to realize the last piece doesn't fit because it belongs to an entirely different box. She didn't cry. Eileen didn't cry. Instead, she got quiet. That was always the more dangerous version of her. When she was angry, she was predictable, cold, passive-aggressive, sharp-tongued. But when she was silent, when her smile dropped and her eyes darkened, that's when things shifted from irritation to strategy. I kept my distance. I wasn't foolish enough to think she didn't suspect me. She wasn't stupid. Just arrogant enough to believe I wouldn't have the patience to pull this off, arrogant enough to underestimate the kind of revenge that doesn't show its face in the form of yelling or slammed doors, but in paperwork and policy and irreversible city filings. She spent the next few days making phone calls trying to find new buyers, but word spread fast in this neighborhood, especially among agents. Historic designation didn't just mean a delay, it meant oversight, limitations, bureaucratic red tape. Once that evaluation process was underway, the home effectively became radioactive for a certain kind of buyer. The ones Eileen wanted, the ones with cash and a vision for open concepts and granite countertop. Now, no one wanted to touch it. Meanwhile, the city's preservation team returned for a follow-up inspection. They were impressed by the level of documentation I had provided: photos, family records, interviews with neighbors who remembered music spilling from the open windows during my mother's piano lessons. One woman, a retired music teacher named Carol, sent in a handwritten letter about my mom's impromptu concerts, describing how she'd sometimes hear Chopin floating down the street as she walked her dog. She wrote, "That piano was the sound of this neighborhood's heart. Losing it was like a silence falling over all of us." I cried when I read it, quietly, in my room, not out of sadness, but something heavier, relief maybe, that I hadn't been the only one who remembered. The commission emailed me 2 days later to say they had entered the final phase of review. The property would remain in freeze status until a public hearing was scheduled, and any attempts to alter or sell it would be flagged by the city. In other words, Eileen's ambitions were officially on pause, not destroyed, but stalled indefinitely. And with every passing day, her frustration became more visible. She snapped at my father more frequently now, criticized his gardening, his cooking, his tendency to leave dishes in the sink. She paced the hallway late at night, talking to friends in hushed tones. "I feel like I'm living in a mausoleum," I overheard her say once. "Every time I turn a corner, it's like she's still here. This house is haunted." I smiled in the dark. Then came the financial strain. The original buyer had been offering well over $1 million. Eileen had already begun spending that money in her mind. She had made a down payment on a condo out of state, transferred funds to start renovation plans, and even refinanced her personal credit line in anticipation of the profit. Now, that all came crashing down. The bank started calling. I saw the envelopes piling up near the front door, unopened, thick with red text and fine print. One afternoon, I passed her office and caught sight of her computer screen. Emails to her lawyer, her realtor, even a desperate message to a preservation consultant asking how to expedite or cancel the process. The answers weren't what she wanted. By this point, my father was beginning to ask questions. He wasn't a confrontational man, never had been, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. The way Eileen's energy drained the room, the way the house that had once been filled with laughter and music now pulsed with tension. He sat with me on the back porch one evening, sipping a cup of tea in silence, until finally he said, "I know it was you." I didn't answer. He looked out over the yard at the wild mess that had once been my mother's rose garden. I should have stopped her when she got rid of the books, the pictures, the garden. I let her do it because it was easier, because I didn't know how to fight. But this, he paused. This was the first time I saw something fight back. I swallowed hard, not sure what to say. He turned to me then, his eyes damp. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me that this place mattered." A week later, I got a call from Martin Blake, the collector who had originally bought the piano. His tone was different this time. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "That woman who tried to outbid you, she backed out, said she had property issues to deal with. She's no longer interested." I felt my pulse quicken. "Does that mean—" "It means it's yours," he said, "if you still want it." I drove to his studio the next day. The piano was there, sitting under a cloth in the corner of the room like some dormant creature waiting to be awakened. It looked just as I remembered, maybe even better. I paid him on the spot, no negotiating, no questions. He helped me arrange for it to be delivered to a friend's apartment for temporary storage. I wasn't ready yet, not until the story was done, but just knowing it was mine again, that it was safe, was enough. When the delivery truck pulled up in front of the house, Eileen was trimming hedges in the yard. She stared as the movers carefully unloaded the instrument and wheeled it into the back of a waiting van. She looked at me, and for once, didn't say a word, not a question, not an accusation, just silence, heavy and tight, as if she finally realized the war she'd been waging wasn't just lost. It had been over long before she knew it started. The house was no longer hers to conquer, the piano was no longer hers to discard, and I was no longer hers to underestimate. She had taken my mother's memory and tried to repurpose it into something tidy and profitable. But some things refuse to be cleaned up. Some things remember where they came from. The cracks in her plans were now visible in every corner of this house, and soon they'd be impossible to ignore. By the time August rolled around, the house was suffocating in tension. Eileen still tried to play the role of composed homeowner, but the cracks in her carefully curated persona had deepened to the point of collapse. She barely spoke to my father anymore unless it was in clipped, irritated phrases about the ongoing disaster and how he needed to get his daughter out of the house. I noticed she had stopped referring to me by name. I had become an obstruction, a threat, a silent, ever-present reminder that not all battles are fought with raised voices. Some are waged in silence and ink, in city records and policy reviews. She hated that I hadn't yelled, hadn't stormed out, hadn't taken the bait. I had simply sat in her guest room and dismantled her empire, piece by piece. The commission's second notice arrived mid-month. The public hearing was officially scheduled. Attached was a preliminary report from the preservation team noting the house's architectural significance, the cultural impact of my mother's long-standing role as a community music teacher, and even references to statements from neighbors and local educators. The report read like a eulogy for a place still alive and yet somehow already gone. My mother's memory was embedded into every line of it. Eileen received the letter during breakfast. She unfolded it with the same mechanical motion she used for her daily newspaper, expecting another update she could dismiss or challenge. But as her eyes moved down the page, I watched her face fall. Slow, deliberate, irreversible. There was no negotiation left. The process had moved beyond her control. She tried one last maneuver. She called a lawyer she had used for a property deal a few years back, asking him to explore the possibility of fighting the designation or at least halting the process until she could sell. She even drafted a desperate letter to the commission, portraying herself as a victim of a vindictive stepdaughter with an emotional vendetta. She used words like personal crusade and weaponized nostalgia, claiming the property had been irreparably altered over the years and no longer retained true historic integrity. The response she received was firm and, in its own way, final. The hearing would proceed, and the review board welcomed all public comments, including her own. But until a final determination was made, the property was bound by the full limitations of the designation process. The financial pressure, which had been mounting in whispers and warning letters, began to take form. The second loan she had taken out, one she had used to place a deposit on the out-of-state condo she never thought she'd lose, was coming due. The buyer of that condo had backed out. The bank had begun reviewing the freeze on her assets, the pending risk factors associated with the property. I overheard her on the phone with someone from the bank, her tone uncharacteristically shaky as she tried to sound composed. I wasn't informed of any preservation process before this happened. I didn't sign anything. I wasn't given a chance to contest. Then silence. Then, yes, I understand, I'll figure something out. The next day, a man from the bank came by. He didn't introduce himself to me, but I saw the documents in his hand, paperwork regarding the mortgage and the lien on the property. He didn't stay long, just 30 minutes. Eileen walked him to the door with a forced smile that barely held up until he turned his back. As soon as he left, she slammed the door harder than necessary, then walked directly into the kitchen and opened a bottle of wine at 11:30 in the morning. My father tried to talk to her once, just once, about the idea of letting it go. He wasn't confrontational, but the strain was starting to wear him down. He approached her while she stood staring at the laminated landmark sign in the yard, as though it had grown roots and couldn't be pulled out. "Maybe we should just stop fighting it," he said gently. "Maybe it's time to think about other options." Eileen didn't yell, she didn't cry, she just turned to him, her voice low and tight. "This house was supposed to be our future, my future. I have put everything I have into it, every cent, every year, and now it's worthless." He tried to say something else, but she raised a hand and walked away. She didn't speak to him for the rest of the night. He fell asleep in the den with the TV still on, his hand resting on an untouched mug of coffee. It was around that time that I started getting messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Neighbors, former students of my mother's. Even a local journalist who was doing a piece on homes with cultural significance that had been overlooked until landmark proposals forced the city to reconsider. Someone had forwarded my written testimony, and the journalist wanted to interview me for a short feature. I declined politely, but I sent her a folder of scanned photos of the piano, old recital flyers, and the article my mother had once written for the local paper about teaching music to children. "Let the house speak for itself," I wrote in my email. "It has enough to say." Then, one evening, I received a call from Martin Blake again. "I thought you might want to know," he said. "Your stepmother contacted me this morning." My breath caught. What did she say? She offered me $10,000 to buy the piano back, said it belonged in the house for historic purposes, tried to sound like she was doing a noble thing, reclaiming a piece of local culture. His voice was dry with irony. "And?" I asked. I told her it was no longer available, that it already had a home. I thanked him, then sat for a long while just staring at the floor. I understood then that Eileen was spiraling, not because of the piano itself, but because the house had turned against her. She had built her identity around control, managing my father, managing the space, managing her image. And now that control had evaporated. The house was no longer a blank canvas for her ambitions. It was a monument she couldn't manipulate. The hearing was set for the end of the month. The commission sent notices to neighbors encouraging them to attend and voice their support or concerns. I didn't know who would come or how many would care, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Eileen had already lost. She just didn't know how to live with that. A few nights before the hearing, I passed her room and heard something I'd never expected, sobbing. Not the performative, manipulative kind she used when she wanted sympathy or control. This was raw, broken, a sound dragged from someone who had run out of options. I stood in the hallway for a moment listening. Then I walked away. She hadn't wept when she sold my mother's piano. She hadn't flinched when she erased every trace of the woman who built this home. But now, with her ambitions collapsed and her foundation cracking beneath her, she finally understood what it meant to lose something that mattered. I didn't feel sorry for her. She had made this house unsellable, but not with its age or its woodwork or its inconvenient history. She had done it with her greed, her arrogance, her utter disregard for what came before her. I had simply held up a mirror, and now she had to live inside the reflection. The morning of the hearing was gray and cold, the kind of weather my mother used to call a pianist sky, melancholy, but full of weight and meaning. I arrived at City Hall early, a folder of documents tucked under my arm, though I didn't really need them anymore. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, written, and submitted weeks ago. The Commission's decision would rest on the structure's age, its integrity, and its cultural relevance to the neighborhood. But more than that, it would rest on memory, on a legacy that Eileen had tried to erase with a for sale sign and a smug grin. I sat quietly in the chamber, surrounded by a handful of community members, a few preservation advocates, and 2 journalists with notepads balanced on their knees. Eileen came in 5 minutes late, wearing a muted gray pantsuit and an expression that had long since slipped from indignation to exhaustion. Her eyes met mine once, and she looked away. The hearing was calm, professional. The city's preservation staff presented their findings, a summary of the home's architectural details, the rarity of certain original features, and the value of preserving historical residential character in a rapidly modernizing district. Then came the testimonials. A former neighbor stood and described my mother's influence on the block. Another neighbor mentioned the yearly recitals she hosted, how the sound of her piano became part of the neighborhood's rhythm. An older woman from the Historical Society held up a photo of my mother in her garden, smiling in front of the rose bushes that were now dead and paved over. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The house was speaking through others now. When it was Eileen's turn, she stood with a stiff posture and a tone so tightly controlled it sounded almost robotic. She claimed that the house had been altered over the years, that it no longer reflected its original design. She insisted that her renovations had improved the structure, made it safer, more livable. "It's not a museum," she said. "It's a home. And homes are meant to change." She didn't mention the piano. She didn't mention the community. She didn't mention my mother at all. And that silence, more than anything, sealed her fate. The Commission voted unanimously to move forward with the landmark designation. They praised the community engagement, noted the strength of the documentation, and made a point to say that cultural significance was not always about presidents or wars. It was about the ordinary lives that shaped a place and gave it meaning. "This house tells a story," one commissioner said, "and it deserves to keep telling it." After the vote, Eileen left without a word. I stayed behind for a moment, shaking hands with the preservation staff, thanking the neighbors who had come. I walked out into the chilly air, feeling lighter than I had in months. Not victorious. This had never been about winning, but at peace. A week later, I closed on a small house of my own. It wasn't anything grand, just a modest 2-bedroom with creaky floors and a sunroom that caught the afternoon light just right. On the day I moved in, the delivery truck arrived carrying the piano. The same piano Eileen had sold for $600.00, the one I had paid 3 times that to reclaim, the one my mother had touched with grace and sorrow and love. The movers wheeled it into the living room and left me alone with it. I sat down on the bench and opened the lid. My fingers hovered over the keys. It had been years since I'd played anything more than a scale, but muscle memory doesn't ask for permission. It just waits. I pressed down on the first key, and the sound that rose up was clear, deep, and warm. I played the opening bars of the piece my mother used to hum when she made breakfast on rainy mornings. Chopin, always Chopin. As the notes filled the room, I felt something shift inside me. Not closure, that word always felt too neat, but maybe restoration. Maybe the beginning of something new built on what had been carefully, stubbornly preserved. The house Eileen wanted to sell would now remain a part of the city's history, a testament not to her design plans or her open concept dreams, but to the woman she tried to erase. And this piano, sitting in the heart of my own space, would carry forward that same quiet defiance. I couldn't bring my mother back, but I had brought her music home.